It was the summer of 1959, deep in the mountains of northern Montana, where the air always smelled like pine and smoke, and silence carried farther than voices ever could. The forest stretched for miles, green, endless, and wild. The kind of place where a man could walk for days without seeing another soul. The old rangers used to say that once you stepped past the tree line, you left the real world behind. Out there, they said, the forest kept its own secrets. On a warm July morning, the sun rose slowly behind the peaks, spilling soft gold through the mist. Ranger Samuel Holt, 38, quiet, steady, and known for his calm in emergencies, started his shift like any other day. He checked his maps, packed his worn canvas bag, and filled his thermos with bitter black coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long. He worked these woods for over a decade, and he liked the solitude. "The forest doesn't lie," he once told a rookie ranger. "People do. But the woods, they just exist." Sam's station was small, just a single-room outpost built from rough logs and stone, tucked near a dirt trail that wound down to Black Elk Lake. The place had no radio signal that far out, so he relied on his old Jeep and a shortwave set that crackled more than it spoke. His nearest neighbor was 30 miles away. That's how he liked it. He didn't have much family. His wife had left 2 years back, and his daughter lived with her in Seattle. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the pines at night, he swore he could hear his daughter's laugh in the distance. That morning, he was assigned to check an old trail up near Cold Creek Ridge, a stretch of land that wasn't visited much anymore. Hikers avoided it because the path was rough and the map showed nothing worth seeing, just woods, rocks, and silence. Still, Sam did his job with quiet discipline. He started the engine, the Jeep coughed awake, and he headed north, gravel crunching under the tires. Along the way, the forest grew thicker. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling animals, just the low hum of his Jeep and the occasional creak of trees bending in the wind. The deeper he drove, the more the world behind him seemed to fade away. He noticed something strange about the air that morning. It wasn't cold, but it felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. By noon, he parked where the dirt trail ended and continued on foot, cutting through tall grass and over mossy rocks. His boots made soft prints in the mud. He carried his map folded in half, but something didn't match. The ridge ahead wasn't marked the way it should be. He frowned and traced the lines with his finger. According to the record, this area should have been an empty stretch of old-growth forest. But the longer he walked, the clearer it became. There was something up ahead. He saw smoke first, a thin, curling line rising between the trees, faint and gray. It wasn't wildfire smoke, it was too controlled, too clean. Campfire, maybe, but no one was supposed to be out there. He slowed down, his heart thudding harder than it should have. As he stepped through the clearing, he saw it, standing quietly among the pines. A cabin. It looked old, built from dark, hand-cut logs. The windows were small and covered in grime, the porch half sunk into the dirt. Moss climbed up the sides like nature was trying to pull it back underground. There was a faint smell of burnt wood in the air and something else sweet, almost like rotting fruit. Sam stood still for a long moment, watching the smoke drift from the crooked chimney. He knew every cabin in his district by name and map reference. But this wasn't supposed to be here. He checked his map again, flipping it open fully this time, scanning every inch. No markings, no old ranger notes, no property lines, nothing. The cabin shouldn't exist. Yet there it was, real and quiet, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Sam's first thought was that maybe some hunter had built it years back and abandoned it, or maybe one of the old settlers. The forest was full of forgotten things, rusted tools, collapsed sheds, even graves from the late 1800s. But the more he looked, the more uneasy he felt. The cabin didn't look abandoned. There was a chair on the porch, a cup beside it, half filled with something dark. He called out, "Hello, Forest Service." His voice echoed faintly before being swallowed by the trees. No answer. He called again, nothing. The wind moved through the branches, slow and soft, like a whisper. He thought about turning back and reporting it to the district office, but something in him resisted. Maybe it was duty, maybe curiosity, or maybe that small voice inside him, the one that told him something wasn't right. He took a step closer, then another, his boots crunching over twigs. The air around the cabin felt colder. Before 1959, not much happened in these woods. The locals from the nearest town, Hollow, lived simple lives, loggers, farmers, mechanics, and quiet families trying to get by. They didn't talk much about the mountains except to say that strange things had always been part of them. "Places remember," old men at the diner used to say. "The land remembers." Sam had always brushed off that kind of talk. But standing there, staring at a cabin that wasn't supposed to exist, he began to understand why some things were better left forgotten. The world felt thinner there. The silence stretched too long between the sounds. He took a breath and reached for the door handle. It was cold, too cold for a sunny day. Somewhere in the distance, a bird finally called out, a single sharp cry that faded almost as soon as it began. He hesitated, staring at the door as if it might move on its own. He didn't know it then, but what he found inside that cabin would change the way he looked at the forest forever. The town would later talk about that day in whispers, how one ranger found something that didn't belong, how afterward he wasn't quite the same. But that part of the story hadn't started yet. For now, the forest held its breath, the cabin waited, and Ranger Samuel Holt took one last look at the empty woods before stepping inside. Door creaked open with a sound that seemed far too loud for such still air. Dust floated through the light as Sam stepped inside, his boots pressing into a thin layer of ash on the floor. The smell hit him first, a mix of burnt wood, dampness, and something faintly metallic like old blood. The cabin looked lived in but wrong, as if whoever stayed there had left in a hurry. There was a bed in the corner, blankets tangled, a pot on the stove, and a lantern that still held oil. The place wasn't abandoned. Someone had been there recently. He walked slowly, his flashlight beam cutting across the walls. They were covered in carvings, names, dates, symbols he didn't recognize. One name stood out, carved over and over. He said it under his breath, and the sound of it felt heavy. There was no sign of anyone inside, but the coffee cup on the porch and the smoke from the chimney told him someone couldn't have been gone long. He checked the back of the cabin. There was a cellar door, half covered by a loose rug. He stared at it for a moment, unease prickling his skin. The metal handle was cold when he touched it. He lifted it slowly, the hinges moaning, and a rush of cold air swept up from below. The smell down there was worse, like damp stone and something rotting. He aimed his flashlight down, but the beam faded into the dark. Before he could decide what to do, he heard something behind him, faint footsteps outside. He froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Slowly, he turned off his flashlight and waited. The footsteps stopped. Then, from somewhere in the woods, he heard a low voice, just a single word carried by the wind, "Leave." His pulse jumped. He stepped toward the window, peering out into the tree line, but saw nothing. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily, not after years of working through wildfires, bear attacks, and lost hikers, but this was different. This felt personal, like the forest itself was warning him. He left the cabin without closing the door behind him and hurried back to his Jeep. As he drove down the narrow trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every glance in the mirror showed the same thing, the endless trees closing in, swallowing the cabin from view. When he reached the station that evening, he radioed the district office and asked if there were any known structures in that area. The man on the other end, a senior officer named Briggs, paused before answering. "That ridge hasn't been checked in years," Briggs said. "Last map record was updated in 1946. There shouldn't be anything there." Sam said nothing for a long time, then muttered, "Well, there is." Briggs told him to leave it alone for now. "I'll send a team next week," he promised. But Sam could tell by his tone that he didn't believe him. Over the next few days, Sam couldn't get the cabin out of his head. He started waking up at night, heart racing, convinced he heard knocks on his door. Once when he stepped outside, he saw footprints near the edge of the forest, small, barefoot prints leading toward the trees. He followed them a few steps, but they disappeared into the dirt. He tried to tell himself they were from an animal, but deep down he knew they were. By the third night, the dreams began. He saw the cabin again, but this time there was someone inside, a woman sitting by the window, staring out into the dark. Her face was pale, her hair tangled, her eyes hollow. She didn't speak, but she looked at him like she was waiting for him to say something. When he woke, his hands were shaking. He started asking around in hollow, quietly, not wanting to sound like he'd lost his mind. Most people said they'd never heard of any cabin up that ridge. But an old logger, Henry Dean, gave him a look that made his blood run cold. "You found her place, didn't you?" Henry asked, lowering his voice. "The widow's cabin." According to Henry, there used to be a woman named Vale who lived up there with her husband in the late 1930s. Her husband had been a trapper, gone for weeks at a time. One winter, he didn't come back. They found his body months later in the creek, throat cut, eyes missing. People said lost her mind after that. She stayed up there alone for years, carving strange symbols into trees, talking to the woods as if they answered her. Then one day, she vanished. No one ever found her body. Her cabin was burned down soon after, or at least, that's what the stories said. But Sam had seen it with his own eyes. It wasn't burned, it was standing there whole. He tried to push it out of his mind, but it was like the forest was pulling him back. Every time he looked at the map, his eyes drifted to that blank patch where the ridge sat. A week later, when Briggs' team still hadn't shown up, Sam decided to go back. He told himself it was just to collect evidence, photos, coordinates, something to prove what he saw, but a part of him knew it was more than that. The cabin had become an obsession. The second trip felt different. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. The sound of the wind had changed. It moved in short bursts, like whispered words he couldn't understand. When he reached the clearing again, the cabin looked newer. The moss was gone from the logs and smoke rose from the chimney again. He felt a tremor in his hands as he stepped closer. The cup on the porch was gone, replaced by something else, a small wooden figure carved crudely in the shape of a man. Its face was marked with scratches, and on the chest the same word was carved. He picked it up, and a deep chill ran through him. Then, from inside the cabin, he heard the floorboards creak. He froze. The door was open a few inches, swaying slightly in the breeze. "Forest Service!" he called again, voice trembling, no response. He took one step forward, and the door stopped moving. He could see part of the inside, the same lantern, the same bed, but there was something different now. A new carving on the wall, fresh and deep. "He found me." He stumbled back, heart pounding, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods had become. No birds, no wind, not even the usual hum of life. Just silence, thick and pressing. He turned and started running back toward his jeep, branches slapping his arms, the ground soft under his boots. When he reached the vehicle, he fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them twice. As he started the engine, he thought he saw something in his side mirror. A woman's figure standing in the clearing, her head tilted, watching him leave. Back at the station, Sam couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He began writing down everything, what he saw, what he heard, even his dreams. The words filled pages. He mailed a report to Briggs, but it came back unopened, stamped, returned to sender. When he called the district office, no one answered. It was as if no one wanted to hear what he had to say. He began to notice the change in him. He looked tired, hollow-eyed, and talked to himself sometimes. They said he'd been acting strange ever since that ridge patrol. One man swore he saw Sam at the edge of the forest one night, standing completely still, staring into the trees for nearly an hour. When he asked what he was doing, Sam just said, "Listening." Weeks passed, and the lines between what was real and what wasn't began to blur for him. He started seeing things out of the corner of his eye, flashes of movement, faces that vanished when he turned. The forest that once felt like home now felt alive in a way it shouldn't be. He began to wonder if it was still there, or if whatever happened to her had never really ended. He returned one final time before everything fell apart. That last patrol would become the moment people whispered about years later, the breaking point. The night the line between man and myth disappeared completely. When he drove up the ridge that day, the trail seemed longer than before. His map, the same one he'd used for years, looked wrong again, new markings, strange lines, circles drawn in charcoal that he didn't remember making. He reached the clearing at dusk, the sky a deep red behind the trees. The cabin's windows glowed faintly, though no lanterns were lit. This time he didn't call out. He just walked straight to the door and stepped inside. The smell was stronger now. The carvings on the wall had the name, repeating like a chant. On the table lay his own forest badge, the metal darkened and scratched as if it had been there for years. He should have run, but he didn't. Something held him there, guilt, curiosity, madness, maybe all three. He thought he heard breathing behind him. When he turned, the door slammed shut. The next morning, his jeep was found abandoned at the bottom of the trail, door open, engine dead. No sign of Sam. The cabin was gone. People searched the ridge for weeks, but all they found were fragments, pieces of wood charred black, a coffee cup buried in the dirt, and Sam's map torn down the middle. Some say he ran off, couldn't handle the isolation. Others believe he found something that was never meant to be found. But those who live near Hollow still swear that on quiet nights, you can see a faint light deep in the forest, where no cabin should exist, and hear the echo of a man calling a name over and over again. The night it happened, the forest was louder than usual. The wind hissed through the trees like it carried voices, and thunder rolled over the mountains without rain. The kind of night that made even the bravest men keep close to their fires. But Ranger Samuel Holt wasn't anywhere near warmth. He was halfway up Cold Creek Ridge, alone, his flashlight cutting through the dark like a trembling blade. For 3 days straight, he hadn't slept more than an hour at a time. His notes had turned into rambling pages of words that didn't make sense anymore, sketches of symbols, repeated names, arrows pointing to nowhere. He told himself he needed answers, but deep down, he knew what was really pulling him back to the ridge. It wasn't a duty anymore. It was her. The last time he'd been there, the cabin had vanished, gone as if it never existed. But he could feel it waiting. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that flicker of light behind the trees, the same shape of a roofline appearing for just a second before dissolving again. It was calling him now, stronger than ever. He followed the pull without question. His boots sank into wet earth as he climbed. The air was thick with mist, and the trees seemed to close in around him. Every sound echoed, his breathing, the crunch of his steps, the faint crack of branches somewhere behind him. He wasn't sure if he was being followed or if the forest was just playing tricks again. When he reached the clearing, his heart stopped for a beat. The cabin was back, standing exactly where it had been, smoke curling lazily from the chimney as if it had never disappeared at all. The door was slightly open, and the same faint light glowed from within. He swallowed hard and stepped forward. Inside, it was different. The carvings on the walls were deeper now, spreading across every surface, not just but words he didn't understand, drawn in jagged, uneven strokes. There were handprints, too, small ones, children's maybe, and on the floor beneath the window was something new, a fresh pool of water or maybe blood. It was too dark to tell. He heard movement upstairs, slow, careful steps. His hand reached for the revolver at his side, though he didn't remember deciding to bring it. He told himself it was for bears or wild dogs, but in that moment he wasn't thinking about animals. He called out softly. The sound stopped, then a voice faint, broken, almost whispering, "You came back." His chest tightened. He turned toward the stairs, the flashlight beam trembling across the wall. "Who's there?" No answer, just the slow creak of a floorboard above. He started climbing, one step at a time, the old wood groaning beneath him. The smell of smoke and rot thickened the higher he went. When he reached the top, he saw her. At first, he thought it was just another hallucination. A woman standing at the end of the hallway, long hair tangled over her face, wearing what looked like a dress the color of ash. She didn't move. Her bare feet were covered in dirt, her skin gray and stretched thin, but her eyes, those eyes were alive, too alive. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and trembling. He froze, hand tight around the gun. "Who are you?" She tilted her head slowly, like she was trying to remember the answer. "You know who I am." He took a step forward, shaking his head. "'S dead." Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No one ever really dies here." Something inside him snapped. The weeks of no sleep, the silence, the disbelief, it all twisted together until he could barely tell where fear ended and anger began. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted a hand and pointed toward the window. He turned to look, and for a split second he saw something outside, shapes moving between the trees, dozens of them like shadows gathering to watch. When he turned back, she was closer, too close. He stumbled back, raising the gun. "Stay back." Her voice turned sharp, layered, almost like more than one person was speaking through her. "You found me, now you stay." Something cold brushed his arm. He fired. The sound shattered the silence, echoing through the forest like a scream. The bullet tore through the air, hitting the wall behind her, but she didn't flinch. She stepped forward again, and this time he could see her face clearly. Her eyes were hollow sockets, dark and endless, and from them something black began to drip down her cheeks. He fired again, then again, panic taking over. Each shot echoed, the recoil jarring his hands until his fingers went numb. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the damp, choking air. When the smoke cleared, the hallway was empty. He lowered the gun, chest heaving, heart pounding so loud he could barely hear anything else. Then a sound rose from below, the creak of the front door swinging open. Someone else was here. He turned and ran downstairs. The air felt thicker, heavier, like he was moving through water. When he reached the main room, his flashlight flickered, then went out completely. Only the faint glow from the fireplace remained, dim and unnatural. The carvings on the walls had changed again. Now they spelled his name, over and over, Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. He stumbled back, dropping the gun. His breath came in sharp gasps as the voices began soft at first, whispering from every corner of the room, then louder, overlapping, crying, laughing, calling his name. He clutched his head, shouting for them to stop, but they only grew stronger. Then he saw her again, standing by the fireplace. The flames cast her shadow across the room, long and crooked. "You wanted to find the truth," she said quietly. "You found it." The floor beneath him began to tremble. Cracks formed in the walls and dust fell from the ceiling. The light flickered brighter and brighter until it hurt his eyes. He screamed her name, not out of anger anymore, but desperation. "What do you want from me?" Her face softened for a moment, almost human. "Peace," she whispered, "but you won't let us rest." The walls erupted with sound, screams, cries, laughter, all blending into a single deafening roar. The ground shook harder. Flames climbed the walls. Sam stumbled backward, the heat searing his face. He reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. He slammed his shoulder into it again and again until it finally gave way. Outside, the air was thick with smoke. He fell to his knees, coughing, eyes watering. When he looked back, the cabin was burning not slowly, but all at once, as if it had been waiting to catch fire. The flames glowed white-hot, swallowing everything in seconds. He thought he saw figures in the fire, faces, hands reaching out, then vanishing. He stumbled down the trail, half blind, clutching his chest. His mind was slipping, his thoughts scattering like ashes in the wind. Behind him, the flames rose higher, the sound of crackling wood mixing with faint, distant laughter. When he finally reached his jeep, he collapsed against the side, shaking. He could still hear her voice in his head, soft and haunting, "You found me." He turned the key, but the engine wouldn't start. He tried again. Nothing. He slammed his fists against the wheel and screamed. In the mirror, the glow from the ridge painted the sky red. Moments later, the world went quiet again. The fire vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. When the search party came days later, they found no signs of a fire, no ashes, no structure at all. Only his Jeep door was open, keys still in the ignition, and his ranger badge lying in the dirt beside it. That night, the forest took him. Whether he died up there or something else claimed him, no one knew. But those who went looking after said they heard it, faint, almost like the wind, a man's voice calling out into the trees, pleading with someone unseen. And if you stood still long enough, you could almost hear her answer, "You found me, now stay." In the days after Ranger Samuel Holt vanished, the small town of Hollow began to change. At first, no one thought much of it. Rangers went missing sometimes, lost in storms or caught in wildfires. But this felt different. His Jeep had been found parked neatly at the bottom of the ridge, keys in the ignition, door open like he'd stepped out for just a second and never returned. The ground around it was untouched, no tracks leading away. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Briggs, the district officer, arrived 2 days later with a search team. They combed the area for a week straight, covering every inch of Cold Creek Ridge. They found no sign of a struggle, no remains, not even ashes where a cabin might have burned. But they did find something strange, Sam's notebook buried beneath a pile of stones near the clearing. The pages were soaked from the rain, but the last few entries were legible. They weren't reports, they were confessions. The words were shaky, desperate, written in a way that didn't sound like the steady ranger everyone knew. "She's here," one entry read. "She doesn't want me to leave." Another said, "The forest isn't empty, it remembers." The final page was just one sentence written over and over, "I found her." When Briggs read it, he said nothing. He folded the notebook, slipped it into his bag, and ordered the team to stop searching. He told them the official report would list Sam as missing under unknown circumstances. But those who had been in the woods that week noticed how pale he looked when he left the ridge, how he refused to go near the tree line after dark. Word spread fast. In a town as small as Hollow, rumors grow like vines. Some said Sam went mad, that the loneliness finally broke him. Others said he found something he shouldn't have, something the forest didn't want to give back. The older folks whispered about the widow again, Vale, and how her spirit never left the ridge. Parents told their children not to wander too far north, and when the wind howled at night, some swore it carried his voice, calling her name. Sam's daughter came from Seattle a month later to collect his things. She was 23, quiet with her father's calm eyes. She didn't believe the stories. "My dad wasn't crazy," she told Briggs when he met her at the ranger station. "He didn't believe in ghosts." Briggs nodded but didn't meet her eyes. He gave her a box, Sam's maps, compass, badge, and the old notebook. He didn't tell her about the carvings the search team had found on trees near the ridge, strange markings, half erased by weather, that spelled her father's name. That night stayed at her father's cabin. The place was silent except for the crackle of the fire. She went through his things, trying to piece together his last days. The pages of his logbook were filled with neat handwriting up until the final week. Then it turned chaotic sketches of symbols, drawings of the cabin, notes about a woman named, each one more frantic than the last. She didn't sleep. Around midnight, she heard something outside, a low thump like footsteps on the porch. She froze, waiting. Then came another sound, soft knocking, 3 times. She opened the door quickly, but no one was there, only the trees, still and silent under the moonlight. She told herself it was an animal. But when she closed the door, she noticed something carved into the frame that hadn't been there before you found me. The next morning, she packed up and left Hollow. For months, people continued to report strange things on that ridge, lantern lights flickering deep in the woods, the smell of burning wood on windless nights, the sound of a man calling faintly from somewhere far away. Most dismissed it as imagination, but others stopped going near the forest altogether. Briggs retired early the following spring. He never spoke publicly about what happened to Sam, but those who knew him said he wasn't the same man afterward. He drank more, avoided the woods, and once told a friend he could still hear Sam's voice on the radio when the signal crackled late at night. The Forest Service quietly removed Cold Creek Ridge from all official patrol routes. Maps were updated, trails were rerouted. On paper, the ridge didn't exist anymore, but people in town still knew where it was, a shadowed stretch of mountain they avoided once the sun went down. Sam's disappearance became a local legend, the kind that kept kids whispering during summer nights. They said if you went deep enough into the forest, you could still find the cabin, standing just where it shouldn't be, waiting. No one ever brought proof. Those who claimed to have seen it never went back. Never returned to Montana. She moved east, married, and tried to leave the story behind. But sometimes she would dream of her father standing among the trees, his ranger hat pulled low, staring at something she couldn't see. He would call her name softly, almost tenderly, and then whisper, "Don't come looking." Years passed, and the story of the missing ranger faded into the background, another mystery swallowed by time. But for the people of Hollow, something had changed forever. The forest that once gave them life, their wood, their water, their peace, now felt like a living thing that watched and remembered. Every autumn, when the mist rolled down from the mountains, someone would find strange carvings on trees near the old trailhead, circles, lines, and sometimes a single word etched deep into the bark. No one claimed to make them, and no one ever tried to erase them. The official record never mentioned anything supernatural. The file in the Forest Service archives was short. Ranger Samuel Holt missing, presumed dead. But those who had been there, who heard the way the wind changed when the search began, knew the truth was something different, something darker. In the end, the crime wasn't written in blood or witnessed by law. It was quieter, deeper. It was the forest taking back what was never meant to be found. And somewhere out there, beneath the endless canopy of pine, a light still flickers between the trees, the faint glow of a cabin that shouldn't exist, waiting for the next person who won't be able to turn away. And if you listen closely, just before dawn you might hear two voices, one calling out for forgiveness and the other whispering in reply, "You found me." Years later, the story of Ranger Samuel Holt and the vanishing at Cold Creek Ridge became something between a myth and a warning, a story parents told in hushed voices, and one the local papers occasionally revisited when the town ran out of headlines. But beneath the folklore, the true consequences lingered like a wound that never healed. There were no arrests, no confessions, and no graves. The Forest Service listed the case as unsolved, then quietly closed it. For the officials, it was easier that way, no scandal, no accusations of negligence. The mountain had claimed a man, and that was that. But for the people who knew Sam, his daughter, his friends, the lack of closure became its own kind of punishment. Holt tried to move on, but something in her father's disappearance never stopped gnawing at her. She went on to study environmental psychology, focusing on how isolation affects the human mind. Her research papers often mentioned the dangers of solitude and obsession. Though she never cited her father by name, those who read closely could tell who she was writing about. In interviews, she would sometimes say, "The forest doesn't just change around us, it changes us." When she finally published her memoir, The Ridge That Took Him, it reopened the case in the public imagination. Readers were drawn to her honesty, her refusal to label her father as a hero or a victim, her insistence that something more complex had happened. The book sold modestly, but it found a cult following among those fascinated by disappearances and unsolved cases. Some called it poetic, others called it an attempt to rationalize madness. But for it was neither. It was her way of making peace with something that could never be explained. In Hollow, life returned to something like normal, though the ridge remained off-limits. A new ranger took over Sam's post but refused to patrol north of the creek. People still heard things, faint laughter at dusk, a woman's humming carried on the wind, the occasional glint of a lantern between the trees. Most pretended not to notice. Sheriff Briggs never spoke publicly about what he'd seen that week, but but in his retirement he kept Sam's waterlogged notebook in a locked drawer. When he passed away, his family found it, the pages yellowed, the writing almost illegible, and turned it over to the local historical society. The curator refused to display it, saying it did fit the town's image. Instead, it sat in the archive, sealed in glass, another ghost among the records. The official story, the one printed in state files and online reports, painted Sam as a man who succumbed to the wilderness. But the people who'd lived near Cold Creek knew better. They saw the subtle changes over the years, the way animals avoided that stretch of forest, the way storms always seemed to linger over the ridge. They called it cursed, but others said it was simply memory, the earth remembering what it had taken. As time passed, the legend began to shift. It was no longer just about a missing ranger, but about human frailty, how even the strongest can be undone by what they seek to understand. Students from nearby colleges wrote essays about the psychological symbolism of the Cold Creek case, debating whether it was about obsession, guilt, or the thin line between faith and madness. No one agreed on a single interpretation, and maybe that was the point. In the broader sense, Sam's story became a mirror for something much larger, the timeless conflict between man and nature, and between what we believe and what we fear. It revealed how quickly people turn mysteries into myths and myths into truths. How justice isn't always about arrests or convictions, but sometimes about recognition, the simple act of saying, "Something happened here and it mattered." Morally, the case forced uncomfortable questions. Did Sam deserve what happened to him if it was punishment at all? Or was he simply a man who looked too long into a darkness that looked back? Was Vale a ghost, a memory, or the embodiment of guilt left to rot in the woods? The townspeople learned to live without the answers. The lesson wasn't in solving the mystery, but in understanding its weight. In the end, justice didn't come from a courtroom or a confession. It came from silence, from a community's decision to remember instead of explain. The forest was left untouched, the ridge unvisited. Nature reclaimed what was lost, as it always does. Never returned to Hollow, but every autumn she donated a sum to the town library to keep the archives open, with one condition. Her father's case file must remain public. "People should see what happens when we stop listening to what the world is trying to tell us," she once wrote in a letter. The broader impact of the story stretched beyond the town. It sparked conversations among park services nationwide about ranger safety, mental health, and the psychological toll of isolation in remote postings. Policy changes followed, more frequent check-ins, shorter solo patrols, and mandatory counseling after extended wilderness assignments. In that sense, Samuel Holt's legacy was one of prevention, his disappearance saving others from the same fate. Yet even as it inspired reform, the story never lost its ghostly edge. Documentaries, podcasts, and online forums dissected the case endlessly. Some claimed new evidence, strange audio, blurred photographs, maps that didn't match official records. Most of it was nonsense. But the fascination persisted because, deep down, people wanted to believe the world still held mysteries beyond science and logic. Ultimately, the Cold Creek case wasn't just about one man's disappearance. It was about how a single tragedy can expose the fragile balance between truth and belief, and how easily we blur the two when faced with the unknown. The people of Hollow moved on, as people always do. But on misty mornings, when the fog rolls low through the valley and the pines whisper against the wind, there are still those who pause and listen, half expecting to hear a ranger's voice calling from the ridge, or the faint laughter of a woman who was never supposed to be found. And maybe that's the truest ending. Not justice, not vengeance, not answers, but remembrance. A quiet acknowledgement that some stories don't end neatly because they were never meant to. They stay with us, haunting the edges of our understanding, reminding us that the line between the living and the lost is thinner than we'd like to believe. For Hollow, that line runs right through the heart of the forest, and it hums softly with every rustle of the leaves, whispering the same words over and over. "You found me.